Herzlich willkommen and welcome to our new English language episode of History and Politics, the Körber-Stiftung's podcast dealing with the multiple ways in which the past matters for current affairs. I'm Gabriele Beudelko, and I'm very happy to introduce you into this very particular episode in which we will be dealing with artificial intelligence. Just a few months ago, BBC News delivered a powerful headline: Artificial intelligence could lead to extinction, experts warn. At the same time, 92% of people asked in Germany in a survey are already familiar with the term artificial intelligence. This is no surprise, as this is the topic on the front pages of newspapers around the world at the moment. However, for most of the interviewed Germans, artificial intelligence carries a very negative connotation, often associated with various fears. Yet experts tirelessly emphasize that artificial intelligence will change our everyday lives forever. Despite this, we know very, very little about the effect it has on our historical and political self-image. For our August episode, we invited Frédéric Clavert to discuss with my colleague Félix Fouque, who is Program Director of E-Commemoration at Körber-Stiftung, the use of artificial intelligence in history education. Frédéric Clavert is Assistant Professor at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History at the University of Luxembourg. And after studying political sciences and contemporary history in Strasbourg and Leeds, and after different academic career steps, he started to become interested in digital humanities when he was working at the former Virtual Center for the Research on European Integration in Luxembourg. Today, Clavert is one of the leading historians in Europe passionately exploring the impact of artificial intelligence on our understanding of history. Currently, he's working on an edited volume that delves into the question, is artificial intelligence the future of collective memory? Today, we particularly look at new opportunities to get engaged with history through the function of a virtual chat GPT, as you may know. Before we start the conversation with our guest, I would love to hear from you, Felix, though, if you have ever dreamed to chat with someone from the past, and if so, who would it be and what would you hope to gain from that conversation?
This is a very good question, Gabi. I think I would choose the great, but today also contested Oscar Wilde, because when I was a young student, I fell in love with his writing. Oscar was brilliant in finding a perfect tone for criticizing the Victorian Puritanism he was back in the days confronted with. He was an outsider who, however, had a huge impact on social, political and also cultural discourses. And this is probably something that we can learn from Oscar for today.
Well, thanks. That's interesting, Felix. And now let's get started with our new podcast episode that will help everyone interested in history education to identify possibilities and limitations also of using generative artificial intelligence for bringing people in interaction with the past.
First, thank you very much for being our guest today, Frédéric. And let us start with a very personal question at the beginning. Do you remember what was your first contact with AI technology as a professor for European history in Luxembourg?
Yes, I do. So first, thanks for the invitation. As a professor at the University of Luxembourg, it was before the University of Luxembourg. It was when I was doing research. As a teacher, it's been 2 years that I'm teaching a bit around large language models, basically. But that's a hard question to answer, in fact, because as historians, we may have all had already contact with AI without knowing it. For instance, if you go to Archive Center, you will take pictures of your archive, of your documents, right? And you might take those pictures with your smartphone, and your smartphone has some AI embedded in it. So some sort of AI-based software application. So as historians, we may have all already used AI without knowing it. As a researcher, what I do is basically I'm doing text mining, and it's been around 10 years now that I'm using text mining. All text mining does not rely on AI algorithm, for instance, but when I use a piece of software called Mallet is a text mining software that is doing, among other things, topic modeling, and this topic modeling is based on LDA, which is a sort of topic modeling, but that is machine learning. That is based on machine learning, which is a branch of AI. As a teacher, I've got a course in master called European Collective Memories in the Digital Era, and there is one session where we use GPT. So GPT is the engine behind Chat GPT, to see how, in a way, collective memory is embedded into large language models. It's a master course that is working quite well.
Yeah, as you already mentioned, Frédéric, AI started also, in your opinion, leaving a footprint on history in various ways, as you mentioned it before. And it offers new opportunities for researching and reconstructing the past, but also changes the representation of history in digital times. And when it comes up to research, AI tools, for example, you mentioned it before as well, make it easier to identify persons in historical photographs. In this episode, however, we particularly look at large language models and their utilization in uncovering history. So how many people are using large language model tools such as ChatGPT, Bard, or Bing? And has its use for your own work by students had any impact on, for example, your marking of papers at university?
How many people are using LLM tools? That I don't know, to be honest, but virtually everybody can use them, because ChatGPT for now surely has a beta software. It can be used by everybody. You create an account and then you can start using it. There are some constraints, but you can start using it. So virtually everybody can use such tools. And through Bing, which is based on ChatGPT, you can also use that kind of tools, clearly. I have not yet been confronted directly, or I did not, two students using ChatGPT for their essays, the essays that they're handing over to me and within my courses. Some other colleagues have been. But I have a bachelor course next semester that is based on essays written at home. And we are currently thinking with a colleague who had the same teaching in German to change how we are going to organize the evaluation of this course. But I have an anecdote to tell still. During this master teaching I was talking about just before, so that was a few weeks ago, we assessed the quality of some texts produced by ChatGPT about Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet is a good example because he's quite well known, but not too well known. I mean, it's not de Gaulle or Bismarck. So it's easier to see where ChatGPT will fail, in fact. But there was this student. She seemed really unhappy. And I asked her why. She seemed so unhappy. And in fact, while working with ChatGPT, she realized that ChatGPT has some sort of writing style, something very neutral. And she had a collective essay to write with other students for another course. And she was really unhappy with the introduction of this essay, but she could not say why. And in fact, while working with ChatGPT in my teaching, she realized that this introduction was probably written by ChatGPT and not by the students who claimed she wrote it. So she went to this other student and asked her if she used ChatGPT. Indeed, she used ChatGPT to write the introduction. And so she asked her colleague to rewrite the introduction, this time with a more human style.
Yeah, we've now already mentioned tools like ChatGPT, but we also introduced the complicated term large language model before now. So could you briefly say what, technically speaking, a large language model is and how does it in the end work?
Yes, so what I'm going to do is to explain it the way I'm understanding it as a non-computer scientist. I remain a historian. So a large language model is basically an AI-powered system that is trained. That's the P of ChatGPT. P means pre-trained. So that is trained on massive data sets. In the case of ChatGPT, it includes, for instance, the use of Common Crawl, which is a sort of filtered snapshots of the living web. So those large language models are mostly based on neural networks. Neural networks loosely imitates how our brain functions. It's a loose metaphor. And neural networks are able to learn from the training data sets. Learning here, it means, in fact, statistics and probabilities. For each word in the training dataset, the AI-based system will deduce the probabilities of this word to be associated with other words. The way it is deducing this is not always clear. It's a bit of a black box. Today we speak about transformers, which is a sort of neural networks defined by Google in 2017. And transformers are better to, let's say, take into consideration the general context of a word within the training dataset. So it's better, in fact. The results produces better than what the neural networks used before 2017. So basically, the text generated by, for instance, Chat GPT are texts made of words that are statistically pertinent, which doesn't mean that they are humanly pertinent or that there is a notion of truth in it. It's, in the end, complex, hard to understand statistics, but it's statistics.
This directly brings me to another question because, artificial intelligence has become a commonly used term. But what are actually the dimensions of the definition? And to what extent is the term and the often used descriptions really linked to a new era of data analytics and data modeling?
Okay, can I start with a bit of history of computing? So basically, there are several families of artificial intelligence. So I'm not a historian of computing, but I have read them. And so several families of AI. And basically, there's a difference between symbolic and connectionist AI. Symbolic AI imitates the way we reason, we think, insisting on logic. And that was popular in the 1980s, 1990s, but then the results were still quite limited. Connectionist AI imitates, again, loosely, see this as a metaphor, how our brain works. Yann Lequin is one of the leading AI researchers today working at Facebook, say that between neural networks and our brain, there is the same difference as a wing of a plane and the wing of a bird. So that's really a loose metaphor. So today it's basically connectionist AI, so that imitates how our brain works. That is the most popular, and in particular deep learning, so those neural networks. And deep learning is today the basis of large language models. But from what I have understood, some large language models are based on connectionist AI, but for some elements, they are still using symbolic AI. So we are going towards something that is in majority connectionist AI, but still uses some advances from symbolic AI. But those both families of AI have roots in the 1960s, if not the 1950s. And it's, in this sense, it's not new. In fact, AI is a project that is really a part of computing since the beginning of computing sciences. Just think about the famous Turing test that was described in an article in 1950. So some authors, some historians even evoke sometimes the old humanities project of creating automatons that looks like us, at least from the antiquity and at least in the Western world. So you can do a really long-term history of AI in this sense. I think that what's new is the fact that computers until the 2010s lacked really power and data to make deep learning-based applications really efficient. And you remember all the hype about big data. In fact, big data and AI, it's more or less the same things, or two sides of the same coin. And since the 2010s, so since this hype about big data, basically we've got the computing power and the huge necessary data sets to make connectionist AI work quite well. In terms of data analytics, data modeling, in fact, I'm not sure there is before and after from the point of view of historians, because as I said, the standard application that we are using today, in fact, are more or less here for 10 to 15 years. Latent Dirichlet allocation, for instance, which is the standard topic modeling application today was defined, if I remember well, in 2008. So that's quite parallel with the rise of digital humanities and digital history. But there's a thing that is changing with ChatGPT, for instance, but there are other LLMs like Bloom. Data analytics becomes far easier, to my mind, for different reasons. First, because you can, so the P of GPT is pre-trained, but you can add another training. So you can have a version of GPT that will be a bit more specialized. So if you do a complementary training on it, you can easily detect, as you say, persons, date, etc. So that's a way to do data mining in the end. There's another thing, which is that because it is today quite easy to write code, including data and analytics code, ChatGPT can really, really simplify your life. I'm writing code with the help of ChatGPT because the code is not the core of my research. In fact, it just enables it. And it's pretty efficient. It's pretty good. And I'm able to read the code and be more or less sure that the code really does what I want it to do.
I definitely have to say that you're definitely a proper historian, because historians love to put phenomena and developments into larger context. And that's what you've done now. As you already mentioned also, the British Alan Turing, for example, or the cybernetics movement of the mid-20th century had often been seen as one of the earliest forms of AI development in history. And thus, in your opinion, historization helps us to understand the current debate regarding the impacts of AI on society and the way artificial intelligence is changing the notion of history through its implications?
I think it's quite important to historicize things, in fact, to historicize the history of AI. And that's, I would say, for different reasons. There's a debate about that, but you could argue that computerization is just continuation of the Industrial Revolution, for instance. So in that case, you can see the advent of computers as in a 300 years context, or within a 300 years phenomenon, which helps us understand that, and particularly when we refer to time, there's a continuous movement towards automation since, we'll say, the beginning of the 19th century. But now when we talk about Industrial Revolution, we go back to the 17th century, basically. So you can see in this sense, Industrial Revolution as first a movement that is quite slow and then accelerates. And that helps us to understand, for instance, how we perceive time. There are many, many authors, Reinhard Koselleck, for instance, that spoke about time and the fact that we have this sense of acceleration of time. And computerization in this way is one more step towards this acceleration of time. And that can help us understand why we see differently time and history today. That's basically something important. But to be honest, I don't always like the tendency of historians to say that nothing's new, in fact. So historicization also helps us to understand what's new. And I think there is, with the networkization of data, with the emergence of personal computer, of servers, of the web, of networks, I think there's a sort of rupture, a sort of radical change. And the massive amount of data that we are producing today, because basically in 1 year, we are probably producing more data than from the beginning of human history to like 2010. That's a big change. That's really a big change. And that enables new things that have some roots in history, but that are still new, that we need to understand a bit better, including AI and how we delegate. Today, we are able to delegate cognitive tasks to the machine. And cognitive delegation to the machine is not exactly new, but today it can become quite massive.
Yeah, and today newspapers all over the world are full of articles looking at the transformative power of artificial intelligence. And for many experts, AI turns the world upside down, especially for those who traditionally worked analog. So historians and memory workers and people working in museums, for example. And you already just like giving an answer on my question, but have, in your opinion, Frédéric, AI and particularly those tools which work with so-called large language models, have these tools the potential to have a not inconsiderable impact on remembrance culture, history education, and the way we think about history also on the long run?
I think we need to look at several things. First, large language models are trained on datasets, on those famous training datasets. And those datasets are embedding views, visions of the historical past, descriptions of facts, and that we as historians may not agree with. So basically, all large language models are coming with some embedded notions about the past that can be quite diverse. And the problem here is twofold. The first part of the problem is that commercial large language models refuse to give the detail of their training datasets. We have a rough idea of those training datasets. It's common core that I've also already mentioned. So basically a sort of snapshot of the web, but it's not the living web. We know that probably Wikipedia has been used, but that's probably in common core anyway. And for ChatGPT, there is a supplementary training, if I understood well, on Reddit datasets. So Reddit is a set of forums on the web, so that's Reddit datasets are good for the conversational aspect. But we don't know the weight between those different parts of the training dataset. So we don't know the detail of the training. And then those datasets are very massive. Common Core, it's 80 terabytes compressed, so much more. And as it's text, it's mostly text. The compression is very efficient, so it's probably more than 200 terabytes. So it's a lot. So it's really hard to assess what's in there and to try to assess what kind of history is in there in those training datasets, what kind of vision of the past are embedded in those datasets. So that's first two aspects. The training dataset is an important aspect to consider. Then it's a question of statistics. So the generated text is statistically pertinent. In a way, look at the generated text as average text, as an average. Hence the typical style of ChatGPT that is very balanced, neutral. And last but not least, it's less documented. To avoid answers of ChatGPT, for instance, that could be inappropriate, answer that would be racist, for instance, there's a supplementary training through digital labor. So basically humans correcting answers of ChatGPT, and those corrections ChatGPT will learn from those corrections. So there are also biases from those humans correcting the answers of ChatGPT. And even when you're using ChatGPT yourself, you correct the answer. So that's also integrating the training datasets of ChatGPT. In the case of ChatGPT, for instance, badly paid Nigerian digital workers were correcting the answers, and lots of them refused to work because it's a traumatic work. That's also some ethics we should consider. So in the end, what do you have? The generated text you get are average. It can sometimes work, probably better in English, because 80 to 90%, we suppose, of the training datasets is in English. Sometimes this average text is also really bad, often in the details. It can look convincing, but most of the details are wrong, and sometimes what's missing is quite huge. So, in other words, it produces text that may appear as good enough, but good enough is not what historians want to get right. It's not what we aim at when we are doing research. We want to do something more than good enough. Good enough is not good enough for historians. And furthermore, in the case of ChatGPT, at least, the data it was trained on dates back to December 2021. It's not about news. It's not about advances in historiography, for instance. So it's a sort of conservative good enough, based on data where recent past is very much more represented than the past before the web or even before 2010, because we're producing more data. So it's a sort of ultimate presentism based on the present as it was in December 2021. So that's another problem. There are much more data about someone who would live today than about someone who lived in the past. So that's also something important that will have an impact on the way we see the past. I hope I answer your question, because it's complicated. It's a complex question.
Yeah, it is. And as we looked at our today's topic in our first questions from a bird's eye perspective, it seems to me that it makes sense to let us dig a little deeper now into today's focus topic, namely generative artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and large language model, something that we call generative artificial intelligence nowadays. And we call it generative artificial intelligence because it is a form of machine learning that is able to produce text, video, images, and other types of content for us as users. The most well-known generative artificial intelligence today is ChatGPT. And to give our listeners probably a good impression of what ChatGPT is capable to do, many of you will probably remember the debate that came up when the Australian historian Christopher Clark published his book, The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914. And the book deals, among others, with the difficult question of which nations and political powers were involved and responsible for the outbreak of the First World War. And as you will probably know as well, it is still an ongoing debate if European nations, quote, sleepwalked into the war. And let us see how ChatGPT answered the difficult question, quote, who is responsible for the outbreak of the First World War? This is the prompt.
The outbreak of the First World War was the result of a complex set of factors and events. While it is not accurate to attribute the entire responsibility to a single party or individual, there were several key factors and countries that played significant roles in the lead-up to the war. Here are some important factors and parties involved.
And then ChatGPT is mentioning the alliance systems, imperialism and rivalries, nationalism, assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, of course, the failure of diplomacy back in the days, and so forth and so forth. And Frédéric, what do you think about the given answer of ChatGPT? Does the answer match, in your opinion, the complexity of the debate? And what are the challenges, in your eyes, within the given answer?
Well, the text is not too bad, to be honest, but it's a synthesis. It's also quite complex. It's a good assessment of if you want a short answer, basically about the outbreak of the First World War. It's not a bad answer at all. So there's no problematization, for instance. So it's not research, of course. So it's not what we expect from our students, maybe in bachelor, but not at the master level. There's no explicit relationship to current researchers or to current research debate, in fact, because it's a synthesis. So, for instance, if I remember well the text, you mention Christopher Clark's piece, but there's no sleepwalkers in this text. So there's no reference to Christopher Clark, for instance. There's no obvious references to those debates. It's very convincing. The style is very convincing. It's really always looks like very coherent. It's good enough in the end. But the problem for me here that you have no clue about the sources of these texts. Where did these texts come from? You don't know. It's a black box. You can ask ChatGPT for references. It will give you references, but they will be made up. Some of our colleagues on Twitter or Mastodon complained because they were contacted by journalists asking them an interview about their latest article. And the title of the article was coherent with their research, but they never wrote it. And that's because ChatGPT gave the name of the article, gave the title of the article. So it was coherent, but false. I have done something very narcissistic. I have asked ChatGPT to write my biography or the biography of some of my colleagues. And for instance, I asked a biography of Andreas Fickers, who is the director of the C2DH ad.
It's normally totally wrong, isn't it?
It was coherent, but for instance, it was because Andreas is a bit more well-known than me.
It's always about the question of how popular you are in the end, right? How much information is in the data set about you, right? So.
And within the references that were at the end to explain what Andreas wrote, there was one of my books. And books from others. So it's current because probably the C2DH website is in the training data set. So there is data about us. So that's why. But it's just that it's statistically pertinent to have the title of this book with the name of Andreas, because probably it's on the page where there is this reference with my name and the name of Andreas for another reason. There's no notion of truth, of false and right in ChatGPT, because ChatGPT is made, it's a large language model, so it's made to produce good language. not to produce something that is false or true or whatever. So there's no references. So this text about the First World War is not bad because it's statistically pertinent and because the outbreak of the First World War is quite well documented. But it's not a text that are satisfying for us. And it's not a text, if it was produced by a student, that would be satisfying when we give a grade to students.
Yeah. In our previous question, we used ChatGPT in the end for reconstructing and summarizing a so-called research debate. But ChatGPT offers much more opportunities. We can, for example, ask ChatGPT to let Otto von Bismarck comment on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, an event that started in February 2022. Bismarck, as many of you will probably know, died already in 1898. And if Bismarck had to react with a political statement to the invasion, what would he say? And this is a snippet from his speech generated and delivered by ChatGPT.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to address the pressing matter of the ongoing war in Ukraine. As an observer of history, it is with deep concern that I witness the conflicts and divisions that plague the Ukrainian land. The struggles faced by the Ukrainian people resonate with the challenges and tribulations my own nation once endured.
Okay, that's a kind of weird response, isn't it?
Thus, it is my duty to offer insights and reflections in the hopes of fostering understanding and, ultimately, a path towards peace.
In preparation for our podcast, I've stumbled, Frédéric, over reports of school teachers in which they mentioned that they let ChatGPT write such speeches and then analyzed and problematized them in their classes. What do you think about this approach?
For me, the text is just nonsense. The vocabulary doesn't seem a second part of the 19th century vocabulary, right? As I said, ChatGPT has been trained on data that is anterior to the Russian aggression because it stopped. The training data sets stops in December 2021. So that's a more subtle time inconsistency, but it's equally important one. Nevertheless, writing that kind of text and asking students to analyze it can be interesting, pedagogically speaking, to show them how bad that kind of text can be, even when it looks consistent and coherent. And from there, you can, even if you always need to be present, ask them to criticize, to make a critique of the text, and then you can, having them starting thinking about how we write history. It's a good training for historical criticism, in fact. So as a teacher, then you will have to find subjects where the answers will be a bit better, subjects where the answers will be also bad. And that's also a way to think about biases that are embedded in those systems, but that also reflects the way we see collectively, not as historian, history and the past, how we write history. And it's also a way to think about data inequalities in the world, because some regions of the world lack data about their history. I mean, online digitized data, including large parts of Africa, for instance. So I think it's a nice way to think about all those matters. So it can be used in teaching.
Another AI tool that is using LLM technology is an app called Hello History, and the creators advertised the app with the words, quote, "bringing history back to life." And the app uses AI technology to create an interactive chat experience that allows people to engage and learn from historical figures, and uses virtual coins with which they can then unlock historical figures such as Gandhi, Marilyn Monroe, Frida Kahlo, and many more in order to chat about historical events and developments, but also about recent political and social challenges. And in the last question, we looked at the problem already of bringing historical figures back to life to comment on current and ongoing happenings, which are taking place a long time after their death. One of the key problems, in my opinion, here is, of course, that the data mined in the system are based to a high degree on text written by and about the historical actors. But what happens in between death and nowadays events? And from which decade of a person's lifetime does a representation of an opinion get extracted in the end? Since, as we know from ourselves, we can easily change, of course, also our opinions. On Twitter, for example, there was a big debate about these kinds of responses that were coming out of the chatbots, because people posted many examples of how Hello History chatbots faked history in the end. One user, for example, asked Nicholas II of Russia, Hello History chatbot, quote, why did you promote the protocols of the Elders of Zion? And the chatbot's response was, I did not promote the protocols of the Elders of Zion. In fact, I publicly denounced them and declared they were an anti-Semitic work that had nothing to do with Russia's Jewish population. Could you please, Frédéric, comment on the answer given by the chatbot and explain to us what the problem is probably within the system that the chatbot is giving us such a wrong response in the end?
So the answer is historically false. It's as simple as that. There's not a single word that is true. It's not even plausible fiction. It's not even virtual history. It's just no way this answer would reflect history. Basically, it's based on GPT, so the same engine behind Chat GPT. They do not say if they have done a complementary training of GPT, if they have optimized it for history, and if they did, with which data. It's a black box. But basically, within GPT, there might be some mechanism explaining this response in this case, because you don't want anti-Semitic answers, basically, when you develop a large language model. So that may be an explanation of the answer. If I can expand a bit more on Hello History, I was quite puzzled when I looked at this website, at this application. They mix fictional and real characters. They provide images of those historical persons that are generated, and probably by image generation systems. And if you look at the details just of the images, it's so inconsistent. Gilgamesh or de Gaulle's portraits are quite interesting because the uniform of de Gaulle has never existed, but it's not plausible. It does not even look French. I'm not a military historian, so maybe I'm wrong, but it does not even look French, to be honest. And Gilgamesh is portrayed as a sort of bodybuilding world champion. So that's not consistent with anything.
Absolutely. It's weird.
It's really weird. So it would be even more interesting to see why they selected those real or fictional characters, why they chose those images, to be honest. That could be a nice master thesis for students, to be honest. Nevertheless, asking students to work on Hello History can be a good pedagogical exercise. Why those characters and not others? How did they choose them? Why this focus on great people of the past, whether fictional or not, or real, assessing the quality of the answers, trying to get information about the system, how it works, etc. All that can be done in teaching. And as I said, it could even be a quite interesting master thesis in public history, for instance, the subject of a master thesis in public history. Furthermore, I think it could be interesting to test a version of a large language model. I would, on my side, prefer Bloom because it's public open source. So to test a version of a large language model or of an image generation system, Stable Diffusion, because it's open source again, that would be optimized for history, and see how people use it. And from the prompts that they write, for instance, we could also see how people are interacting with history. That would be a way to get primary sources about how our fellow citizens see the past. That could be very interesting. So there are things to do, but to be honest, not the way Hello History is doing it.
Yeah, it seems to me that generally speaking, AI technology contributes to a trend we already observe for many years now, something we normally linked over the last couple of years to the practice of fake news. So the boundaries, that's also something that you've mentioned in your last answer, the boundaries between fact and fiction are becoming more permeable. So in public, scholars and expert and tech entrepreneurs themselves call for regulation, probably also because of this. And the History Communication Institute, a leading institute focusing on the influence of technology on our understanding of the past, raises in their thought-provoking statement on artificial intelligence the important point that discussions about AI should encompass commitments to its integration in education rather than solely call for more regulation. Do you agree with this, Frédéric? And how would you recommend using tools such as ChatGPT in teaching history, for example, at schools and universities?
So I agree with the HCI statement for several reasons, including the fact that lots of calls for regulation are hypocrites, not really honest. When there's a group of people asking for 6 months of pause in the research in AI, and when Elon Musk is signing it, that's hypocrite. What Elon Musk wants is to gain time for commercial purposes. I'm a French citizen, so we sign petitions and we sign op-ed, and the people you are signing with, it's almost more important than the text you're writing. And in this case, when you look at people signing that kind of calls for regulation, it's really people I don't want to sign with, to be honest. So that's the first reason. I think we should focus on critical thinking because it's one of the core of our work, right? In the end, we're quite good at that as historians. So we really should stimulate critical thinking among students, which is something we do every day. That would be critical thinking toward AI and critical thinking about what's a document today, what's a text today, the complex relation between text, image, and veracity and truth. That's things we can do. And we already do, in fact, but maybe not with LLMs, but that LLMs can be used for that too.
And the policy statement we looked at also asked for stronger cooperation between historians and tech companies developing AI tools, often used by public and students, but also by everyone with a genuine interest in getting information on historical events and figures, as well as an explanation of historical developments. Why is this necessary, Frédéric, in your eyes? And what issues of current AI tools, such as Chat GPT, can this cooperation probably counterbalance in the end?
I think this cooperation is necessary. Where I do not fully agree with the HCI statement is that it's not a cooperation with commercial firms. It's although cooperating with researchers, with public researchers in computing sciences. I've evoked already Bloom, which is a large language models, which is a cooperation between computer scientists and Hugging Face, which is a sort of French but US-based startup that is quite important in AI today. That's the way we should do, and we should work with our colleagues in computer sciences a bit more, that's sure. Where we can bring something important is that the tech companies and sometimes our colleagues in computing sciences, they don't have a clue about what's a primary source, about what is a primary source. And basically training datasets are primary sources. They just train their systems on datasets that just look for massive datasets, and that's it. Their point of view is to have just lots of content. I'm saying that it's a generalization, and somehow some colleagues are far better on this point. But usually they have no clue about the content of the training datasets. And in the end, at least the big tech company, they don't care about the content of the trained datasets. Some of them, once their system is trained, then they start thinking about biases. And they should think about biases when they select the training dataset. So that's where we could help those companies and in the private and also in the public sector understand how to assess training datasets, how to balance them, how to perform a critique of their datasets. And that's a second small disagreement with the HCI statement. We should not be too self-centered. Anthropologists, literature researchers, sociologists, political scientists, lawyers have a lot to say too. We should see this in really an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary perspective. All humanities and social sciences should be involved in the design of artificial intelligence systems. And in some domains of the tech industry, it's already the case. Ubisoft, for their Montreal branch, has worked. They have worked with historians for Assassin's Creed, for instance. So what's possible for video games industry should be possible for the AI industry, right?
Unfortunately, Frédéric, when I have a look at the time, we have to more or less have to come to an end. And over the last 45 minutes, we've talked about ChatGPT and its spin-off product, historical figures. And it seems to me that it's just fair to give the system also the chance to express its opinion on our History and Politics podcast. And I've chosen, of course, the great Charlie Chaplin to say what he thinks about the podcast we produce. So Charlie, what do you think about the History and Politics podcast of Körber-Stiftung?
Well, as someone who lived through some of the most tumultuous political times in history, I think it is important to stay informed and educated on politics and world events. Podcasts like Körber-Stiftung's History and Politics can be a great resource for learning about different perspectives and historical contexts that shape our current world. It's always fascinating to learn about how the past events continue to impact our present-day political climate.
So Helle History is not able yet to imitate the voices of its historical figures, although other projects such as the AI-driven digital Albert Einstein clone produced by algorithms show that technically the imitation of voices of historical figures is already possible. So Charlie's voice was, as the other given answers in this podcast, produced with AI voice-over technology. Yeah, we have touched on various challenges of teaching history with AI and also looked at possibilities and certain necessities for giving historians the opportunities to play an active role in the development of AI tools and AI systems. We hope that we could deliver food for thought for all of you. Thanks, Frédéric, for sharing your expertise. And of course, thanks for listening out there. We hope to see you again for the next episode of our History in Politics podcast. The last words, however, are yours, Frédéric, and our podcast normally ends with a short or brief wrap-up. All things considered, is ChatGPT paving the way for new forms of getting in interaction with the past for you?
I think it's probably a good way to have new pedagogical ways to teach history. That's sure. It will be probably something we must take into consideration when we address a large audience, but I hope that it will not be the main point of entry of our fellow citizens to the past.
This was our History and Politics episode with Frédéric Clavert on the use of Chat GPT in history education. If you are interested in this topic, you will find links and hints and a short glossary in our show notes. A manuscript is available on the website of Körber-Stiftung if you want to read what you have listened to. If you are interested in more English language episodes of our History and Politics podcast, just scroll in your podcatcher. Don't miss our special series, for example, The New Germany, that deals with the multiple aspects of Zeitenwende in Germany and beyond. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked our podcast, we greatly appreciate your subscription, of course, if you haven't done so yet. And we would also appreciate your recommendation to others. To explore more of our work at the History and Politics Department, please check out our website at Körber, which is Koerber-Stiftung.de. Stay tuned, all the best and goodbye from Hamburg.